Okay. Good morning, everyone. Those of you who are listening and watching in, I'd like to welcome you all to Sabrina Ramos Rubén's defense today, her translation of Marta Traba's Propuesta, polémica sobre el arte puertorriqueño. And I'd like to extend also special thanks to our readers, to the members of the committee, Professors Raquel Torres Arzola and Craig Graham. Thank you very much for your time, your patience, your work, your collaboration. We really appreciate this. It goes beyond the call of anyone's normal duties at the university to participate in something like this. So thank you again. Now I'd like to hand over the floor to Sabrina so that she can give a presentation as part of her defense. So Sabrina, good morning, and please proceed.
Hi, thank you, David, for that introduction. So now I'm going to start sharing the PowerPoint that I have prepared for this presentation right now. Give me a minute. Okay, can everybody see the presentation?
Yes.
That's great. Okay. So, well, for starters, good morning to everybody who is seeing this presentation. Today, I'm going to talk about my thesis project, which is a translation of Propuesta, polémica sobre el arte puertorriqueño, translated as a polemics of Puerto Rican art, to fulfill a requirement for my master's degree in translation. So first of all, I first heard of Traba while I was studying my bachelor's degree in art history. She was considered a controversial but fascinating character. And this was back in early and mid 2000s, a time when a lot of blogs on art criticism were emerging, or her figure was going through a revival. So after reading a Polemics, since then I knew that I wanted to do a project on Marta Traba. So when I applied to study in the PGT, I already had in mind the undertaking of this translation as my thesis project, as a way of keeping alive the historical memory of her text, which I feel has been waning a little bit in younger generations. So first, let's talk a little bit about the life of the author. Marta Traba was born in Buenos Aires in 1923. She studied art and letters in the National University of Buenos Aires and began her career as an art critic in the journal Ver y Estimar in 1947. Then she would move on to Europe in 1948, where she took courses with very important figures in sociology of art and art theory. Then she went on to settle in Colombia in 1954, where she was a professor at the University of the Andes. She was also the host of a television show on art appreciation. She established the Museum of Modern Art of Bogota, and she also wrote extensively on Colombian art and literature and on Latin American art in general. And she was often at the center of very intense debates. So she was, oh, sorry, I apologize. Okay. There we go. So she was exiled in 1968, and she went on to relocate in many cities in the Americas and in Europe, including Montevideo, Caracas, San Juan in Puerto Rico, Barcelona, Paris, Princeton, and Washington, D.C. She died in 1987, and she was the victim of a plane crash in Madrid, but she left behind a rich body of literature, which included theory and criticism of art and literature, novels, short story collections, and a poetry collection. She was also considered a paradigmatic art thinker and critic of Latin American art from the 60s and the 70s. So I think it's very important for us to talk a little bit about the context, because her work was deeply rooted in the events that were going on at the time of the publication of Polemics, which was in 1971. So in the late 60s and early 70s, it was a period of upheaval in international politics. We have the Cuban Revolution, we have the Cold War, US interventionism, military coups in Latin America. The US was sponsoring aggressive anti-communism, May 1968 in France, and the flourishing of a lot of cultural movements. Whereas in Puerto Rico, in the decades in the 40s and the 50s, Operation Bootstrap was implemented, and that implied that a lot of foreign capital was injected into Puerto Rican economy, and that caused a temporary period of prosperity and a shift towards industrialization. Also, there was a lot of student conflicts against the Vietnam War and repression from a right-wing pro-statehood government. In the Puerto Rican visual arts, in the early 60s, abstract expressionism was a predominant aesthetic, whereas in the late 60s and the early 70s, we have more interest in avant-garde and countercultural styles. Other artists just kept producing art as they had in the previous decades that addressed identity issues, and other artists started creating highly individual figurative languages. So let's talk a little bit about Polemics as a book and what it is about. First of all, like I mentioned already, it was published in 1971 by Ediciones Librería Internacional, and it was based on Traba's observations of Puerto Rico during an 8-month stay as a professor of aesthetics. It was drafted as a response that was a very problematic and controversial piece penned by US critic Jane Jacobs, titled Art in Puerto Rico and published in Art Gallery magazine. In this article, he coined the term way out group, in which he referred to a group of artists who embraced avant-garde aesthetics. And the book basically mostly condemns the predominantly shallow art world in Puerto Rico. And this included critics, galleries, and institutions. An important concept of polemics is eclecticism, in which critics praise whatever art without any discrimination. Galleries and museums would exhibit whatever art they decided to show without really a good criteria, without good criteria of selection. And in the case of artists, it would be artists who would just engage into a variety of styles, and instead of just going for one direction. She also criticized galleries and museums for catering to tourist tastes instead of showing art that addressed the reality of Puerto Rico. And what I mean with the taste of tourists is basically things like landscapes of Old San Juan, or Spanish fiestas, or things like street urchins, alongside more original Puerto Rican artists. She also addresses the colonial relationship between the US and Puerto Rico. What she argues is that the US fostered an artificial modernity in the island, and in the process of fostering this modernity, they basically they attempted to drown out what was local Puerto Rican culture by sponsoring metropolitan values. And when I say values, I mean cultural values. But on the other hand, there were artists who resisted, right? And to her, these artists who resisted this onslaught were artists who really express the Puerto Rican spirit or essence. And they manifested it in a particular tone, which was gloomy, melancholic, sort of like a neo-romanticism kind of a thing. And also, she also praised artists who had made unique imagery that contradicted the stereotypes of, the colonizing gaze. So, also, interestingly, Traba also criticizes artists that engage into styles that imitated Mexican muralism, or artists that basically represented folklorism or indigenismo. And in the case of artists who embraced avant-garde, she saw them as artists that were basically compliant with the colonial rule and colonial values. So in regards to translating her, when I was rereading, I had read this book many times, but when I was rereading it, I couldn't help but notice from a translator's perspective and from a contemporary perspective, how many problems the book has, but also it's reassessing its relevance in today's world. For starters, in what concerns the problems in the book, she basically praised art from rich Latin American country while disparaging art from poor regions. And this follows very problematic dynamics and ignores the power dynamics within Latin American countries themselves. Also, she shows a dearth of knowledge of Puerto Rican art history. And this is extremely problematic because she makes very ignorant assertions on Puerto Rican art history. And she also basically, with her concept of eclecticism, she looks over our culture and our history in the Caribbean and in Puerto Rico, where we have been layered with several cultures because of colonialism. And this has resulted in a syncretic culture. And another problematic aspect is that in her dismissal of the avant-garde, she overlooks the dynamics of cannibalization from local artists, who everything that was any hegemonic aesthetics were adapted and cannibalized by artists and to show their reality of their culture. And another problematic aspect is that she centers her book around the work of cisgender men, even though at this time we know that there were plenty of women working art. And she basically ignores the work of many women artists, except for Mirna Báez and Olga Albizu. So in contrast, though, things that I believe that really give her relevance in today's world is the fact that she began a genealogy of women art critics and curators. At this time, before Marta Traba, women didn't publish very much. It was a male-dominated field, and Marta Traba basically began a genealogy of women like Teresa Tio and Margarita Fernandez Zavala, and who would later become very important voices in Puerto Rican art history. She also set the groundwork for feminist and anti-colonial perspectives. And she also set the precedent for contemporary approaches that are closer to radicalism, because she was her framework was basically neo-Marxism, and she also provided a very powerful and relevant description of what is going on right now in Puerto Rico, in which we are dealing with problems like the colonial settling of our ancestral lands due to tourism, financial colonialism, and a Hawaiianization of the archipelago. So when I was translating, I had a very particular readership in mind. And for starters, I think that we should commend that translating a work that denounces the oppressive nature of the relationship between Puerto Rico and the US into a metropolitan language might seem contradictory. But we also have to keep in mind that it's the language of many oppressed communities. And this translation of a Polemics is dedicated to them, especially the Puerto Rican diaspora, who has many monolingual English speakers. Also, any Anglophone Latin American diasporas, any Anglophone Caribbean and Latin American communities, fellow marginalized audiences, such as English-speaking Black, Indigenous, and immigrant communities, and any readers and researchers interested in anti-colonial approaches, feminist genealogies, Puerto Rican and Latin American art in 50s, 60s, and 70s. So my approaches when translating this text were rendering Trava's voice, for starters. And I based my approach on Gayatri Spivak's essay, Can the Subaltern Speak? And I have a quote here that I would like to share with everybody, and it goes like, if in the context of colonial production, the subaltern has no history and cannot speak, the subaltern as a female is even more deeply enshadowed. So I want to point out that even though Traba was a celebrated critic and cultural manager, when she arrived in Puerto Rico, she was by no means a proletarian or subaltern person. But we have to keep in mind that she was writing as a woman at a time where feminized voices were seldom heard in the visual arts. Also, she was writing from a colonized, or using Spivak's words, enshadowed context. And keeping in mind the fact that translation is an activity informed by power dynamics, it became even more crucial to convey the complexity of her voice. And it was a voice that that would shift from caucasity to lyricism, but it was always assertive and passionate. So what I did was that, first of all, I took advantage of the rich lexicon that English has to offer. And I also streamlined certain sentences. I also used transposition just as a way of improving clarity and precision. And I also used a vocabulary and that was of high register, which would equal that of the source text. Another approach that I also took was using intersemiotic translation, in which basically I read the description that Traba wrote in her text, and then I would look at the works. This was a way of rendering the text in such a way that it increased comprehension of the readers and eased the visualization of the works. So basically, I'm going to list several problems that I faced while translating and what my solutions were. For starters, I think the thing that stands out the most is the copious misspellings, grammatical irregularities, and inaccuracies. And at times, these mistakes resulted in serious ambiguities, such as the example that I mentioned in my presentation, in which she writes a phrase, and I'm quoting the original text, sino de defender las obras cuya tendencia. We know that sobras in Spanish means leftovers in English, but in that case, I had to carefully assess the text and the context and to fix these errors. And I would fix the other mistakes, the spellings, the grammatical irregularities, through research and following English general rules. So another issue that I apologize again. Another issue that I had to face was the fact that she used South American dialects, and I'm a Caribbean Spanish speaker. And I found a lot of very unfamiliar terms, and this was solved by consulting glossaries and dictionaries. Moreover, another challenge that I found while translating this text was capitalization of art movements. And that took a lot of subtlety, because in English, you capitalize specific movements. But in terms of general style, you don't capitalize. So I had to carefully read context to know which term was supposed to be capitalized and which wasn't. For example, in the case of realism, in which she talks about, at times she talks about realism as a 19th century movement, whereas at times she also talks about realism as a general style. And another issue that I found was that while I was translating, I noticed there were a lot of references that might strike as unfamiliar for English speakers who are not of Hispanic or non-Spanish speaking Caribbean or Latin American background. So in this case, what I did was the expansion of the text. I expanded the text to and render it in a way that the reader, could understand it. For example, in mantón, which is just literally translated as shawl, I added Manila shawl so the reader could understand what the author was referring to. Also, footnotes were added to clarify issues of context that a reader who is not informed of the context of art in the 60s and 70s might understand. Further issues were she uses some problematic language in the text in the analysis of a piece, The Storm, which is displayed here in the presentation, in which she writes, and I'm going to quote my translation: "No savage scenting the storm from the back of a cavern, but a citizen wearing a shabby undershirt and a threadbare fedora." So this is problematic because we have a representation of a man who is evidently an Afro descendant, a Black man, and the fact that he uses brutality and savageness so close to Blackness might be very problematic in today's world. So I decided to offer a literal translation so the readers could discuss and analyze the racial aspects of her work. Another problematic issue that the book has is the use of the term primitivism, to describe art of the mid-20th century made by Haitian autodidact artists. And this designation has been criticized because it originates in a colonial gaze, specifically the gaze of North Americans who discovered Haitian folk art after the US military occupation of Haiti. So I decided to leave it as it was and translate it literally because to reflect the prevailing usage at the time, and also to leave it to the readership to assess other racial and colonizing issues in her work. So another issue that came up was the translation of estadounidense. And I aim for not using American because of its imperialistic overtones. So I opted for using US or from of the United States as preferred equivalents. And last but not least, The Polemics is a book that relies on intertextuality. Is a work that is interspersed with references from other authors. And in most cases of direct and indirect quotes, I use a translation that already existed in English. The exception was Jack Agüero's rendering of Julia de Burgos because it is a problematic rendering. So I decided to retranslate the cited text. So overall, this was a challenging work, but it was a fascinating project. And besides, getting to translate Traba was an honor. So thank you very much.
Okay.
Yeah, I'm trying.
No, I was trying to unmute myself. Thank you very much, Sabrina. Before we turn the floor over to our readers, so that they can have so that they can give their own feedback to your work, I just have a couple of questions. The woodcut by Tufino, which you titled here, silk cotton tree. That's a ceiba, isn't it?
Yes, that's correct.
I think we should. I think we discussed this, but I think we should preserve the name ceiba. And you know, it could be footnoted, but ceiba is a very important. It's a very important marker. And I don't think that it should be eliminated. And I think that silk cotton is also confusing to any reader anyway. And there's nothing silk cottony about those trees. So
I'm sorry to interrupt you. There it is. It is when the tree starts flowering, it releases like a sort of floss.
Okay.
And that's why it's called silk cotton. I opted for that because I know that the ceiba is also a tree that is present in other Antillean places. And, you know, I basically used the Antillean name in English. I'm sorry, Caribbean, not Antillean. The Caribbean name in English. But if you think that ceiba is a better option, I don't mind at all.
Then a footnote, because it's also, it's very important. And by the way, if you do research on it, you'll find that in English, ceiba is also used. But I mean, it's even very important to other regional cultures. Central America, for example, I mean, the Maya, the ceiba is a sacred tree. In Africa, it's a sacred tree. So, you know, I mean, it's a really important symbol. The other thing too is that, just to clarify something, you use the term cannibalization, and I want to make sure that everybody understands where you're taking that from. I think you're taking that from the Chicampos brothers in Brazil, and so that we understand what their whole approach to translation was, that it was an act of cannibalization, as a mockery, in fact, of the way that the Europeans incorrectly portrayed many Latin American cultures as actually performing cannibalism. So in any event, I just wanted to make sure that that got clarified.
Yes, thank you very much for that.
Okay, but in any event, okay, so I will shut up now, and I will hand over the floor to our readers. Does anyone want to go first to give their feedback? Raquel, Craig?
I don't have a preference. I mean, I can go first, or Raquel
Well, you're
can go first.
already here, so you
okay.
can go.
Great. Well, first I want to say congratulations. I thought you did a really good job. Really great job. And I say that because I'm someone who had very little information about the world of art critics and history here in Puerto Rico. I love art, but I didn't have as much information as I do now have. I do have some questions about the foreword, so I'd like to start there. And I had spoken to you about this, and I think it's important to kind of bring this subject back up at the defense. And one of my things that I noticed in your foreword, that you talk about her desire to reach a broader audience, right? And that basically she lashes out, she rails against the highbrow reader. But what I didn't get in the foreword was that she, in fact, is a highbrow artist and critic. She talks about the kitsch, of Puerto Rico, which is putting the art down. And so I'm kind of wondering if in the foreword there needs to be, or I think that there needs to be more information, your analysis, it's like the foreword, right? About that the fact that she is basically warring against herself in many ways, right?
Yeah,
I mean, she's a controversial figure, but it's because she is actually, she's looking at the other, but the other is indeed her in many ways, right? And she's saying, she's pointing the finger, but she doesn't really point the finger at herself, and I think that might be important, maybe a line or two, just to kind of say, hey, I mean, I do have a question about her background. I don't think that you touched on it. What class was she from in Latin America is very class, right, centered. And so I'd like to know that. And I think that the reader would do well it would benefit the reader to know that as well.
Yeah, first of all, I absolutely agree with you. I think it's extremely contradictory. I would gladly add a sentence or two on her subject. And I believe her father was a Spanish immigrant, and he had issues with alcoholism. And I can't recall much of her mother. I do recall reading her biography, the issues. I think they had I believe he was maybe a journalist or a writer of some kind. And what I recall is that her childhood was unstable because, of her father's condition. And I don't know if she was maybe bourgeois, more or less, but she definitely comes from a high class standpoint. And I think that a lot of people who have criticized her work have pointed that out. And I am very glad that you also pointed it out today in this presentation.
If I just might ask something here, I mean, Argentina is a slightly more, complicated situation. She could very well have come from a strictly middle class and even struggling background. So I think maybe it would be best to know, but obviously she has a, to use the French word, hauteur. She certainly has an arrogance that, maybe is part and parcel of art criticism sometimes. But yes, she does definitely represent quite often, as Craig says, some kind of hegemony, and we're not sure what it is, whether it's the Latin American upper class or, we're not really sure, but she does quite often act against herself. But I would be interested to know, maybe if you could find out those details more about, her own upbringing and what kind of class situation. And I'm sorry for interrupting. I'm off now.
I agree, and I agree, and I think that's basically what I'm echoing that, David, because it's so important. Because I remember reading on page 16, it's Haitian primitivism, and it's like, even that term for me just grates on my ear, right? And I know that as a translator, because I'm looking at this as how you would approach it as a translator, but I also have to think about the actual source text. And so I'm looking at both things, which is brings up another point that I think is important. Perhaps this goes beyond you, Sabrina, but this is my first time being a reader, and I'm very happy to be a reader within the department. But I think that what a reader needs, like readers such as myself, I would have loved to have seen or have had access to at least a chapter of the source text, just so I could look at what she's saying and then look at your production of it, your rendering of it, and kind of be on board. Or I kind of feel that I'm slightly handicapped because it's a wonderful rendition, right? It reads very well. It reads like an art critique reads. It reads like something from an art journal. It reads very well. It's the active voice is there. I mean, if we get to talk about the grammar, it's all in the active voice. It's very sharp. It's very clear. I say her tone at times is cynical and dismissive, but piercing at the same time. And it's very nuanced, with a sense of, this woman really has a commitment to this field, this discipline. I can feel her love of art and for everything that people produce and call art. But I do think that having the source text would have actually made my experience as a reader that much better, because I would have been able to look and compare as if I were in the class as well, and looking at both renditions. So,
I'm sorry to interrupt you so much, but I believe I sent the source text along with the translation. It's a Google document because it's so heavy. It's a scan, and I don't know if you noticed that.
For some reason,
attached.
Yeah,
I will gladly resend it to you. And
that would be great. Yeah, because I just like to kind of glance it over, because I don't remember, for some reason I didn't get it, or it didn't open or whatever. But when I opened everything up, I just saw the translation. So I just kind of read it as if looking for grammar and looking for structure, looking for tone, looking for lexicon, and I'm looking for all of the things that I think are important for a reader to look at, obviously, in translation. But great job. I mean, a great job. I have a question about the...
I just want to ask something. I mean, I looked at the email today to make sure that I had the latest version of everything that was sent out to everyone. And these are separate documents. The source text is a PDF. There's no problem in downloading it.
Oh, okay, great. Okay.
So
right.
I
send that again. I'd appreciate that. Yeah, I'd appreciate that. But I love words, and so I want to talk about the choice of words and how you came about using, creating, choosing these words like in your lexicon. So I'd like you to talk more about that if you could. And
well, yeah, sure. I basically just approach translation as a writer. I'm a writer myself. And so I think that feeling, just as feeling is an important part of writing, so it is also when you're translating a work like a Polemics, which, Marta Traba was also a writer. Like I mentioned at the beginning, she published a lot of novels, which are very, very good, actually. And they're actually being translated because they're seen as feminist texts, actually. And so I feel that she's very literary when she writes. There's a lot of color in there, a lot of feeling also, and a lot of intelligence. Even though her work is extremely problematic, her style of writing, I would say, is sharp and complex and very keen. And when I chose word, when I was looking at synonyms, I think I spent a lot of time looking at synonyms, a lot of time. And I would try to choose what I felt was, as a writer, as this intuition that comes upon reading a text. I try to choose synonyms that would feel as adequate to the tone that she was trying to convey in that part of the text that I was translating at the time. So it is a very intuitive process for me and a little hard to verbalize, but I hope this answer satisfies your question.
What sources did you use when you had to go to a higher source and say, okay, I need to know the difference and make sure that this is the actual word? What sources did you use for that?
I used Merriam-Webster. I also use the Oxford Bilingual Language. I use Power Thesaurus also a lot. And I would, me translating, I would be scrolling Power Thesaurus all the time, just looking for the word that I felt was the right word for what she was trying to convey, or the right term, or the right idiom. And those were basically my main sources. Sometimes I would also use the synonyms available in Word, but when that wasn't satisfactory, I would use online sources. Sometimes I would just think, oh wait, this is this. It would just, it would just emerge in my mind, and I would just, translate it as such. Obviously, with the support of David, my reader, who is, I want to mention, so supportive. Thank you. And his edits were so useful. Just wanted to mention that.
Yes. Good job. Raquel, I'm going to let you speak.
Thank you, Craig. Hi, Sabrina. Hola.
Hi, Raquel.
I want to thank you for counting with me to do this work. I have to say that it was a pleasure to read your translation, and it was a pleasure also to read your translator note. I think that you have made a beautiful analysis of Marta Traba's work. More than a translation, you are doing a beautiful analysis from our contemporary perspective, and you have shown that the decolonial perspective is necessary, and it's an urgent approach to the texts that have que sentaron las bases of our approaches to art in Puerto Rico and in Latin America. And I have to say that I would like to speak in Spanish so I can, you know, be more, more close to my own self. Tengo que decir que conocía los textos de Traba desde mucho tiempo, ¿verdad? Y conocía, ¿verdad? Las contradicciones que has descubierto en el texto y que has entendido en el texto y que has mencionado en el texto en tu análisis de la nota de la traductora. Y creo que has hecho notar o haces constar que Traba es una mujer de su tiempo. Ella pertenecía a su momento histórico y pertenecía a ese momento histórico en que el pensamiento, ¿verdad?, era crítico, pero al mismo tiempo pues tenía visos de clasismo, de racismo, de colonialismo, unos visos enormes, ¿verdad?, que no solamente vas a encontrar en el texto de Traba como mujer, vas a encontrar en muchos textos también de hombres y de otras personas con otras identidades, inclusive aproximaciones poco críticas al contexto propio en el que se desenvuelve. De hecho, la historia del arte en Puerto Rico tiene muchísimos visos de clasismo y de racismo y de misoginia, ¿verdad? Y el hecho de que hayamos borrado de la historia del arte un personaje, por ejemplo, un artista como Cecilia Horta, deja ver abiertamente el clasismo, racismo y misoginia de los textos en la historia del arte en Puerto Rico recientes, es decir, 1998, por ejemplo. Así que en ese sentido, me parece que hace mucha justicia al texto de Traba, mirándola desde la perspectiva feminista, validando su voz, ¿verdad? Dejando ver que Marta Traba escribió desde la oscuridad y publicó desde la oscuridad, pero al mismo tiempo me parece fascinante cómo logras tener eso en perspectiva, respetando, ¿verdad?, el hecho de Traba escribir como mujer, pero al mismo tiempo ser crítica en relación a sus acercamientos, por ejemplo, a lo que mencionabas, de las palabras como salvajismo, de las palabras como, hacia, por ejemplo, Haití, ¿verdad? Esos acercamientos que todavía hoy día la institución del arte, una institución, ¿verdad?, amplia, con muchas instituciones adentro, no ha logrado superar. Desde mi perspectiva, seguimos todavía teniendo muchos visos de clasismo y de racismo y de misoginia dentro de nuestro diario vivir como profesionales de museos, como profesionales del mundo del arte, como críticos, como curadores. Todavía tenemos mucho que superar. Así que en ese sentido creo que tu aportación es maravillosa y es fundamental, ¿verdad? Y para mí fue una gran alegría leerte, tengo que decirlo. Tengo solamente una recomendación para el final de tu nota como traductora. Haces el señalamiento de la palabra del uso Americans en vez de estadounidenses. Esto es en la página 16 de la nota de traducción. Dices, likewise, it is crucial to acknowledge of the imperial nature of the using the term American to refer to the people of the United States and the fact that the term has been subject of critiques, particularly from thinkers and writers from Latin America. Yo quisiera pedirte, ¿verdad?, y recomendarte que añadas una nota al calce donde señales esas traducciones, esos señalamientos, ¿no?, donde señales autores específicos, para precisamente, ya que el hecho de que tú hayas traducido el texto de Traba al inglés, obviamente permite que identidades marginales dentro de Estados Unidos y dentro del habla anglosajona puedan tener acceso al texto, pues que también puedan tener acceso a quiénes son esos pensadores latinoamericanos que han estado señalando de que we are all America, you know, so creo que es bien importante y le va a añadir obviamente mucha más fuerza a tu texto. Así que sin nada más que decir, Sabrina, gracias por esta gestión. Creo que esto es un acto de amor, más que un acto académico, es un acto de amor también y de respeto a quien fue Marta Traba y su figura, al contexto bajo el cual las mujeres hemos estado trabajando y escribiendo en el mundo del arte, pero también es una gran aportación a futuras discusiones en relación a cómo debemos acercarnos a los textos de ese momento. Así que muchas gracias.
Gracias a ti, Raquel.
Sí.
I just actually, you know, now that I was looking at that page, I noticed that there's a misspelling there. This is page 17, but it's Roman numeral 16 of your preface. You have Haitian misspelled. In quotes, Haitian primitivism. It's missing an I there.
Okay.
And also, if you go up further in the preface, there are some spacing issues. Let me find the page. Okay, no, it's not a spacing issue. It's on Roman numeral 10. You have a block quote there that's not correctly spaced or indented. The entire thing should be indented, 1/2 space, 1/2 inch, and no space between it. I hope that there are no other quotes that are like that. A lot of this we went through before, so, but, you know, I will take one last look at this again. And I just want to, Raquel, I just wanted to say one thing. And it's a very common thing that people say, la nota del traductor. We don't say nota de traductor. It's a prefacio or an introducción. But a nota del traductor is just as a nota al calce. So anyway, I'm sorry. Even in our program, some people will say, sí, la nota del traductor. No. Es el prefacio, la introducción del traductor. Anyway, I don't think I have any other comments right now. I think you did such a brilliant job. And, you know, I still think, though, that I have an issue with who your audience is. And I know, I think that you clarified it a little bit by saying that you dedicate your work to these people. That's a different thing. And I think that's wonderful. But you have to understand that scholarship exists. Scholarship is there. Scholarship is classless and classist. Scholarship is raceless and racist. But scholarship is there, and regardless, people will want to read this. So, you know, there is so much interest in the United States now, for example, in Latin American art, and, you know, that problematic term, Latin American art, and you mentioned Mosquera as well. But at the same time, you know, these are important voices. Hers is an important voice, although it is very much a period piece, but it's still an important voice. And so I think that for scholarship in general, this is important. Okay. So
thank you.
that's just my feeling, you know.
No, I agree.
The dedication that you might want to make to the more peripheralized, to the diaspora, to, you know, whoever you want to make that, you know, the subaltern, whoever you want to make that dedication to, that's another issue. But scholarship is scholarship.
Mm-hmm. So you just to clarify, because I'm taking notes of what you're saying, you feel that maybe my audience is different from the people who my translation is dedicated to.
Yeah, you know, the thing is that, I know I've had this discussion also with other, in other defenses and with other students, but this idea that, you know, my translation is for English-speaking Puerto Ricans. My translation is for Anglophone Caribbean peoples. My translation, and the thing is that, but we have to understand that, no, I mean, Puerto Rico should be known everywhere. It should be known everywhere. And I don't think that we should put a boundary on it and say that it's only for this group of people. That's my feeling. That's my feeling. And
okay, I tried addressing that when I said that I wanted to foster, and I don't think I mentioned this in the presentation out loud, but I think it is mentioned in the PowerPoint, that I wanted to foster transnational solidarities but I could certainly expand that and clarify and fit what you just said into that concept.
Okay, I know, I think in your presentation, actually, you worked it out a little bit better, especially toward the end. You worked it out, and also the fact that you said, dedicate, you know, my work to. I think that's wonderful when you say that I dedicate my work to, you know, these groups of people, because I feel that these groups of people are important to me, and they are important.
Yes.
And also they've been historically overlooked, and so I think that that's great. But as I'm just making a point about how I think scholarship is scholarship.
Okay.
That's that. I just wanted to ask if anyone has any other comment about the translation, about the introduction or the preface or anything else. Okay, then I think we're ready to eject you for a moment, Sabrina, so that we can discuss our what we're going to do with this thesis. Okay.
Okay, great.
Here, and not only do we feel that this should get a sobresaliente, but also an extra mérito of recomendación para publicar. So it's a great contribution you've made here.
Thank you so much.
De hecho, Sabrina, obviamente la recomendación de publicación está de parte del comité, pero en términos personales te diría que continúes este trabajo y el análisis que has logrado hacer, poniendo en perspectiva desde diferentes marcos teóricos lo que son las grandes aportaciones de este texto, pero también sus problemáticas, ¿no? Y que continúes el análisis y en relación a otros textos fundacionales de la historia del arte en Puerto Rico, que es importante desmenuzar también. Creo que tienes un gran futuro como traductora, pero también como crítico, ¿no? Y como teórica. Así que te conozco personalmente y sé las condiciones bajo las cuales has estado trabajando, así que te felicito grandemente. Eres un modelo a seguir. Nada, lo mejor para ti siempre.
Gracias, Raquel, la verdad estoy llena de emoción.
Okay. Congratulations, Sabrina, you really deserved it. I just want to say one last thing to our readers, that you will be getting a sheet of paper that you have to sign and also put the grade that was agreed on. You have to use a scanned signature. You can't just do something. You have to use a scanned signature. So please, be aware of that. But it will be coming to you pretty soon. And okay, so now I'm going to say goodbye. Let's just say goodbye. Sabrina, say goodbye.
Bye.